Thank you very much. Let's give another round. Well, thank you. Please. Can you start maybe with you?
So first, from a practical thing, as you can hear, this is not my regular voice. You would think that's because he was in the bar last night. Probably you're right. But I brought my bonbons and my cup of tea, so I hope I make it. So there will be time for questions, but I will not give an answer. All craziness on the stick, they would say in Dutch. I have to work. So my presentation that I will give in 20 minutes is a bit what in fact Frank was asking to Alan. Will it emerge in the current conditions we are in? And that's the uncertainty we have. And I would say yes. I think it is the moment when it could try, but we have to realize that it's the moment to act upon. So the title of my presentation is "Why does space matter in a circular economy?" And the subtitle is "The window of opportunity between sustainability and geopolitics." And I reflect foremost from a planning perspective, because I'm both a geographer as a spatial planner. So in broad terms, mostly I'm at ASOP or at RSA here, and it differs in the way the presentation are given. So if I would be at ASOP, Latour would be all over the place, but I think in this environment it's not that much. But I start my presentation with Bruno Latour. I think most of you know him. He passed away a few weeks ago, and in his last article, which is part of a very interesting special issue on war ecology. So to reflect first, there is within, you could say, within the philosophy environment, something really interesting going on in the discussion, how sustainability is increasingly being linked to spatial policy in a way. And in the article, part of that special issue, Latour has a question. Most of the article I don't understand, but I found his research question though. That he asked, is there a moment that Europe can form a nation by deciding to depend on the material condition that it pretended to ignore during the period of false peace in which it believed itself to be? So the point he wants to make is that at the moment there are two wars coming together. The war against climate change, that of course we are losing in the last 5 decades or so, and of course the war on Europe with Ukraine. That's only the first of apparently what Henry Jung says, first of many shocks that come in the way that we are threatened. We as also normative here, of course. We as Europe, what are we, and should we fight for that? And I was already working on this chapter for quite a long time. So suddenly this popped up, and I thought, hey, that's in a way also what I try to say. Of course, not in the same quality, but I will try to make my arguments. So very quickly, there are some principles of a circular economy. And the most basic one is, like Alan showed, we make things circular. And if you translate that in an R strategy, what's mostly done, this is basically recycling. It's everything but waste of energy or a landfill. And in the most parts of the world, that would be tremendous achievement if you achieve this. But for example, places like the Netherlands, this is already the business as usual. So that's why the higher R strategies are more and more emphasized, that we have to move to those. And in a way, if you summarize those, it's about this. It's slowing down the material flow. And if you really slow it really down, you are in the highest R strategy, that is the refuse. But always there will be some flow of materials. It's depending on how slow you move with materials and energy, that in a way says what our strategy are aiming for. And most of the policy documents, but also research, are in one way or another working on this. But more and more, you see also popping up a third principle, and that is that flow of materials, or the geography of that production and consumption system, has to become smaller, and that then translated in localism, for example, and etc. It was yesterday also in the plenary. And there are many discussions going on, and circular economy is only one of those, like post-growth, degrowth, donuts. And indeed, if you see also in all those debates, sometimes they pop up that local production here on the right. And it's easy to say that, it's easy to draw, and with all due respect. But if you think about it, and especially in this environment of economic geographers, it doesn't make sense to reduce your geography of materials, because that in all the centuries we have developed our thinking of how geography in an economic way should or could be developed. It's in fact completely the opposite. So we have had, at least in the last decades, but of course globalization is way older. We have had that hyper-globalization, but even David Ricardo already said 3 centuries ago, specialization is in fact quite logically, it's not so, from an economic point of view, not so good that England would make wine, and if I remember well, Portugal makes textile. It would be better if both specialize on one of those, and then trade happens. That's basically what I think he was the first who described, in fact, the basic specialization and the geography linked to that. And indeed, it is easy to say we have to have more local production consumption system, but it's very hard to make that concrete. And although we know the ecological disasters of our global systems are, of course, a one-on-one consequence of our not localized system, it's not that the answer to that is directly local. It's maybe that indeed it's not circular. That's not the same as it should be smaller, because there are already at the moment many studies that say, let's imagine that all cities in this case go towards a localized food system. The world is gone. There are so many places around the world that really don't have the necessary resources to really develop a sustainable local food system. I don't think of Egypt. They will never be able themselves to produce at least decent food for themselves. So what this article in Nature proved or argued is that it would be good that the Netherlands, which are already the second absolute food producer in the world, would keep on doing that, because the conditions to produce food in the Netherlands are so good, the system is so good that the world in fact gains, because you don't destroy other ecosystems around the world that are not that fit as Netherlands. This is a very narrow perspective, I know, but this is exactly a very strong argument to oppose that argument of localism. And then I go, of course, in the governance. If you are then in a daily basis in discussing policy decisions, well, you lose. That's exactly the point. So that middle principle here, localism, is very hard to make it concrete, especially when you go into the real discussions of taking decisions. And Frank already said it in a paper 4 years ago, circular economy will also be globalized. Maybe another different aspects. I think you reasons from finance and skills, also in materials, what will remain global. Maybe some will be more global, but for sure some will become more local. But that's exactly the difficulty, that we don't know what will or should become more local or maybe more global to really go today into policy action. And I think that that uncertainty of the geography is at the moment treating the whole circular economy discourse. And we know many concepts have passed by. Alan has done a lot of research on that. You can call that a wicked concept, but the danger of such concepts when it's not really clear is that the momentum is gone. It goes into discussion, it goes into definitions. I think if you want to be cited a lot, you publish an article on how to define the circular economy. But that is in fact not really the thing we have to do. It's a sign that we are again moving towards discussion among us instead of thinking of what should be done. And that's a danger. Because if the geography is not clear, it's also not clear from a governance perspective who has to act. And if it's not clear who has to act, it's very difficult to take up responsibility, if at all it's your responsibility. And increasingly, you see also that there is a fierce opposition between these vague sustainability decisions, because in that operationalization, you could safely say it's not fairly distributed. So last week, the climate activists blocked the private airport port of Schiphol in the Netherlands, and of course the yellow jerseys. That's all based on that. Well, why should we bear more relatively than others? So it's also again who is responsible, and not only in geography but also in classes, you could say. And if we don't think out this argument, I think everybody here in this room probably who has worked on circular economy, all the steps we have made on social, biodiversity, water, energy, will also be threatened, because if that concept gets burned, in fact, everything gets burned, and that would, I think, be a worst case scenario. So is there a way to put this principle of localism more central in the discourse of circular economy? And I think there is, because if you look at the last decade or so, what has happened actually in the circular economy application? There have been, in broad terms, two things happen. On the first, firstly, there has been a lot being developed on the abstract geopolitical level. So in fact, it started in China, and so circular economy has to help them and become less dependent on several critical economic sectors. Then quickly, it was also adapted by the European Commission and I think NATO too. And in fact, every geopolitical bloc points out that the circular economy is a very important strategy, not from the ecological point of view, but from trade wars. And this is a very recent report from the European Science, Center. And indeed, we have to, as a European Union, reduce our strategic dependency on supply of materials in order for the energy transition, if I remember well, and to achieve that circular economy is a stretch to go. And also on the lower policy level, you see that popping up. So the Netherlands have it quite central in their discourse. In fact, all the European state members, increasingly also provinces and cities are pointing it out. So that has happened. On the other way, there has been a lot being done on the concrete applications of circular economy. So we started in a way with circular lighting, and that you could rent your lighting systems. And then quickly it in fact scaled up. So at TU Delft, we tested it in a building a few years ago. By now, I think there's no architect anymore who doesn't know how to design and also build. Well, that's not completely true, but at least it's growing that you can build a circular building. So if we keep on scaling that up, are we then entering in a circular economy? Well, of course not, because these two, on the one hand, the downscaling, and on the other hand, the upscaling, are now coming together, and it's really becoming a conflict, you could say, or at least a challenge. Because conceptually, and I don't have to explain this so much to you, conceptually, networks of in this case, nations, communities, are interfering with the concrete spaces, geographical spaces of products and location. And somewhere in between, that's now really the challenge. And you could appoint that as a circular area, circular region, circular city, it doesn't matter. But it's not only a location and it's not only a network, it's something both. So you cannot only design it from a 3D perspective, you also have to understand the systems. And that makes it very difficult in policymaking to really know what to do. And you see already where I'm going to. Exactly here, it is indeed a downscaling that comes together with the design, so that principle of localism is also in the application becoming a very challenging thing. So if literature says, and I do too, that circular economy is not footloose, well, we are increasingly being opposed of that idea that in reality it's not footloose at all. On the other hand, we could also say it's not only by design. And also literature is indeed saying, no, it's not because you have designed a certain building that you're there. So you see already also in literature that these two are coming together. But we should talk beyond literature. So what I have told here is that the application, both in the application, you see that we are going towards a question of what is a network space in circular economy. In fact, it's just basic economic geography, you could say. And if we are able to develop that idea better, I'm quite sure that all the rest we have developed all together, from industrial ecology to architecture to socialist to whatever grassroots movements, will also have the momentum that they no longer have to push, or it depends on how you see it, push or pull. You have to really convince people now that circular economy is a good thing. I think there's a momentum that everybody says circular economy is really needed, and then you will see from a government perspective, I think, a super acceleration of the application and the operationalization of all these ideas. That's exactly the momentum. If you lose that momentum, it could be the complete other way, that everything gets burned. All the things we have invested, also for public means, could become redundant. So to conclude, in fact, until now, the circular economy has always been very positive. It was always a win-win. Nice to have, but increasingly we are seeing that it will cost. It will cost us, and that's also what Bruno Latour and also, in fact, the president of the European Commission stated latest, that Europe has been very relaxed. And the materials come from China, the energy comes from Russia, and the military comes from the United States. So we could in fact do the nice things. You can see it around. I still see the UK as Europe in this case, but you get my point. So we are now really pointing out, okay, this is not how we can continue, at least not if we want to, in one way or another, preserve our norms and values. So the cost is kind of getting clear. But it's also a spatial part. And that's where, at least in the Netherlands, in local policy making, that's really not on the agenda now. It's still very much in how can we politically sell this, how can we thrive on it, how can we make nice environments. And it's mostly that we already know that the circular economy in spatial terms will not be a nice environment, at least not in the short term. So we are still able to cherry pick. We are still able, from a local governance perspective, to cherry pick a circular coffee reproducing facility or an incubator, and all these nice spatial ideas are in fact reinvented by just putting circular before it. But in a way, we have to really move towards the real elements within that flow of materials and of consumption and production. Alan in fact said the true critical elements is always very spatial, that we have to take account of that in our spatial planning, because at the moment we are still externalizing those towards other parts of the world. What's here? So I think there's a bit of opportunity to combine that urgency with the day-to-day spatial planning. And I think that window of opportunity is really now. A window of opportunity never is a long window of opportunity. It's very short. So when I talk with policymakers, they also have to realize that suddenly probably their boss, being it an alderman or whatever, a ministry, will ask them, can you provide me the necessary knowledge to take this cost? And if we as policymakers or academics are not ready to give that input, we also will not see that impact being realized. So also we as researchers, I think, strive for impact for society, have to be ready to, at that moment, give clear guidelines in a way that could help. And I look, of course, at the planning agency in the Netherlands that is, of course, on the front line there. But we're there together, I would say. And that's in fact why we write the book. So it's aimed at policymakers, not at you, not at academics in the first place, but at policymakers. So the type of writing is also a bit different. But it's exactly this point. So it is the window of opportunity wherein space suddenly becomes very important. And space is not only geography, it's also about social, economic, cultural, ecological, technical, and also monitoring. That momentum is now. So I think that's the premises of the book. And I think if it goes well, it can also go the other way around. Maybe we see a complete acceleration because of that uncertainty. If we don't realize that, I think you're completely right. We could end up exactly where we, maybe even worse than we started, in a way more linear economy. I think you're completely right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Håkan. Let's open the floor for some questions. One hand at the back. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah.
I noticed, like a lot of these are going towards policymakers and governments and expecting the government to be the implementer of change in a lot of ways. One of the things that we've seen recently that seems more promising in some ways is that over 77% of professional investors are investing in a company based on their ESG targets. That means where before they'd say, oh, we'll reduce by 10%. And I was like, oh, that's cute. They didn't care. Now they say, we'll reduce by 10%. And if you don't, an active investor can hold you to it. It's now fraud. Like when you say window of opportunity, it's really interesting to see these corporate boards are now providing the leverage to attack the problem at the company, which for us seems more interesting because the company will often heavily, in the United States, heavily influence your politicians. So who is the actual choke point? I'm curious to hear if that's something that you're seeing as an item here as well, that the corporate governance now is providing that window to offer real change that is based off of, jail.
Yeah, very good point. And I'm not an expert on this, but also in other research, I indeed came up with this. For example, in the United States, you have the Patriot Act. That's already a very important difference with Europe. So the Patriot Act, in fact, can be called in that the government asks to the companies, which are not one-on-one American, that they have to produce materials for the the United States of America. And that was the last time enacted during COVID by Trump. As for example, Philips with its factories in the United States had to produce, breathing masks. And I think it can be used even to weapon factories that if there's something going on, that factory has to produce, I don't know, cars. That legacy exists in the United States. So to say that it's only for policymakers, on the way it's true, but can you see a difference? I think the difference in the European Union is way more clear. So if you're completely true that companies, of course, are really advantaging in their operationalization of whatever it is, sustainability. But the question is, if it becomes critical, will that also, in our case, the European Union, contribute to our normative goals? And I don't know if that's will happen in the same manner as, for example, in China, where you don't have almost a difference between public and private. And even in the United States, you could argue that it's not always that clear, but maybe here it's more clear than in other parts of the world. And the essential thing is that most CEOs, let's take, for example, Shell or Unilever, which are Dutch companies, I would doubt if really choices have to be made, and it will cost them too, if they will produce more locally because they are part of Europe. I don't know if that will happen. So yes, my message here is in the first place to policymakers, because we at the moment don't have really the instruments to jump on the wagon of what you completely rightly say, that a lot is happening there, but it's still the question, is that also beneficial for Europe or not? But it's a very difficult discussion, I guess.
Hi, my name is Bryony Goodwin-Hawkins from the National Institute, National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise here in the UK. And I was really excited actually to see you take a more critical perspective on localism. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for that, because I think in this cities will save us from climate change discourse, we tend to have this quite lovely idea of the localism here. And certainly from the rural perspective that I work in, a lot of this discourse leaves the areas that we represent with exciting opportunities to milk the oats and recycle the rubbish, which I can't say that we're greatly hanging out for. But you pointed out to this idea of spatial cost. And I wanted to ask a question about that because we see these lovely diagrams that every NGO puts in their brochures and we see them on everyone's slides now. And I wonder whether you see particular sort of pinch points in the circle or where the spatial costs might come up, whether there are particular areas we need to think about there.
A very good question. I want to, the sir in the back from the United States. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But in former presentation, you said GHG is so central. I think that will be one of the first costs we have to take because, and I will start with a statement that the CEO of the Port of Antwerp in Belgium made a few years ago. And he said it would be a good thing that the CO2 rises in Antwerp. It was in the newspaper. So of course, everybody was like, what? What do you say? It's completely against everything we are working on to decrease the CO2. And now a very much public important person, as being the Port Authority CEO, says that the CO has to rise. But his reasoning was quite logical. So he said and the Port of Antwerp is quite an industrial port, if the CO2 would rise in the Port of Antwerp, that would mean that probably a lot of functions that have been externalized in that loop of materials are reshoring or being established again. So we as Antwerp in that case are making again the products ourselves, also the cost for that, in fact, happening where they are being produced. And of course, he reasoned that's not definitive. So at short term, there would be an increase, but because of the strong pressure from Belgium in this case, of Europe, to become more sustainable, which is in many cases still higher than in other places around the world, on the longer term, the CO2 would decrease much, much faster. So it also depends on how you delineate your area in terms of what policy decisions you make. And that will be the first cost, because, for example, if you look at another discussion, I think Copenhagen in Denmark is seen as the most sustainable city in the world, I guess. But there are some studies that say, yeah, but that's because Copenhagen closes all the factories within the city and just moves it beyond the city premises. And then the counting of the CO2 only happens within the city. So CO2 is a global challenge. And that's exactly the point why it's so difficult today to act, because there's no institution that's globally so powerful to act upon. So you can indeed, in that policy game of what to do or what not to do, cherry pick and still say, oh yeah, if you don't do it, I don't do it. It's exactly what's now being discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's exactly why it's so difficult to really, and why the war on climate change has been lost for five decades. So that, I think the CO2 is at the moment, in fact, preventing on the longer term to become less CO2. Yeah.
One last question. Can I keep it for later?
Yes, well, thanks very much. So I think the urgency is quite clear. And I think in order to sort of seize this window of opportunity, we also need sort of positive images of. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts of what sort of the geopolitical and geoeconomic patterns should look like when we hopefully are transitioning to a circular economy.
It is a difficult one, especially for the Netherlands, though, because Netherlands by far have profited most of the globalization, also in spatial terms. The Port of Rotterdam and Schiphol, and also the services boomed enormously, while at the same time a lot of the other functions within the world, especially industry, moved away or at least not developed in the same way. If that era is over, the question is what is then exactly the future of the Netherlands? How do you earn your money? You cannot bring it from the rest of the world. You cannot sell your service to the rest of the world, at least maybe not in the same manner. So the image can be both, or the Netherlands, which the European Commission demanded, by the way, for the Netherlands, increases its industrialization, or the European Union becomes a bloc with more integration, and in fact the Netherlands keep on doing what they did for the global, but now for the European Union, being the service hub logistics and also other services. Yeah, I think we don't know that yet, how that specifically will develop. And then the literature on relatedness is quite useful to see if a we is there, and a we you could say is European Union, and we know what is critical, what should at least on the short term be more facilitated in what parts of Europe. So the image of Netherlands, I think, will also be in that deglobalized world, quite the same as now, services. But that means that the relation with, for example, Germany or other parts of the world that are better in manufacturing have to be improved. And then the image is, for example, that the Rhine becomes quite essential again, because that's your lifeline towards the rest of Europe. So not anymore looking towards the ocean for Netherlands, but more and more to the back. That are quite powerful images, I would say.
Carol, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to move on. Thank you very much. And probably also thank you.